The water hissed before anyone moved. Inside a concrete building surrounded by the Texas mesquite trees, 50 German women stood barefoot on cold cement, stripped down to their underclothes, trembling in silence. The thick air carried the scent of dust and iron. A U.S. Army sergeant at the door barked an order through the translator, his tone sharp but not cruel. "Everyone inside. You'll wash before your uniforms are issued." To the Americans, it was routine standard hygiene before processing new arrivals. To the prisoners, it was a nightmare that had taken physical shape. None of them moved. Fear was written on every face, as if an invisible hand held them in place. One woman whispered, her voice brittle and breaking, "They're making us shower together." Another clutched the torn hem of her shirt like armor. "This is how it starts," she muttered in German, her eyes wild. "This is how they kill us." When the pipes above them groaned to life, a shudder went through the room. The sound alone was enough to paralyze half of them. The women's eyes darted upward, searching for the invisible death they had been taught to fear. Every muscle locked tight. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them what awaited prisoners in the West: humiliation, torture, extermination. They had seen the films, heard the speeches. The Americans were monsters, they said, who disguised cruelty behind smiles. The word shower had become synonymous with horror. Then, instead of poison, the pipes sprayed cold, clear water. The women screamed as the first icy drops hit them. A few tried to run, others covered their heads as if from rain made of acid. Then the truth hit them all at once. It was only water. One woman sobbed and fell to her knees. Another began to laugh, high-pitched, wild laughter that teetered on the edge of madness. A third pressed trembling hands to her face, whispering, "It's not gas, it's just soap, it's only water." At the door, the sergeant frowned, confused. He turned to the translator. "What's wrong? The water's too cold." The translator, a German-American corporal named Meyer, understood immediately. He swallowed hard and said softly, "Sir, they thought we were going to kill them." The American took off his cap. "Jesus," he muttered, suddenly hollow. For a long moment no one moved. The women wept quietly, some from shame, others from the unbearable release of terror. One older woman, her hair grey and matted from weeks on trains, picked up the bar of soap she'd been given. She turned it over in her hands, white and fragrant, a small, ordinary miracle. Then she began to wash, her tears mixing with the water. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I never thought I would cry over soap. But when the water came, and it was only water, I knew we had been lied to all our lives." Between 1942 and 1946, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners were held in the United States. Germans, Italians, and Japanese soldiers scattered across the far corners of the country. Among them, a few hundred were women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, captured with retreating units in North Africa and France. They were sent to remote camps, far from war, far from home places like Texas. There were fences, yes. Guards, yes. But inside those fences, something unexpected waited: not hatred, not cruelty, but order, food, and dignity. To women who had grown up under the iron shadow of the Third Reich, where mercy was weakness and compassion treason, it was a kind of captivity they couldn't understand. Years later, one of them would tell a historian, "When they made us shower that first day, we thought it was our end. But it was our beginning." The train that had brought them there was a relic of war itself, rattling across the sun-scorched plains, its windows crusted with dust. Inside, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, motionless. Some still wore Red Cross armbands, now faded to grey. Others clutched small bundles, a photograph, a handkerchief, a rosary. The war in Europe had ended for them in a burst of chaos, but in their minds it raged on. They had been told that surrender meant slavery, that the Allies would brand them, starve them, or worse. The fear had taken root so deeply that even the passing sunlight through the train's window looked like deceit. As the train slowed near the small Texas town of Hearne, they braced for the sight of barbed wire, of dogs and rifles. Instead, what they saw through the grimy glass made no sense. Men in wide-brimmed hats leaned lazily on fences, boots dusty from the fields. Some were chewing tobacco, others were unloading crates of bread, flour and beans from the back of a truck. A group of children on bicycles stopped to stare. There were no whips, no black uniforms, no shouting, only the slow rhythm of American life. When the doors opened, hot air flooded in heavy with the smell of hay and cattle. The sun burned white in the endless Texas sky. The women squinted, shielding their eyes. "Where are the guns?" one whispered. Another muttered, "Maybe they're waiting inside." They stepped down from the train. The guards didn't shout or strike. A young soldier, freckles across his nose, sweat dripping from his cap, held out a canteen. "Welcome to Texas," he said slowly, unsure if they would understand. They didn't understand the words, but they understood his tone. It wasn't cruel, it was calm. One of the prisoners, a nurse named Lisa, remembered that moment for the rest of her life. "He spoke to us as if we were guests, not enemies," she recalled. "I didn't know whether to be insulted or grateful." The camp itself seemed unreal. Wooden barracks stood in perfect rows, surrounded by wire fences that gleamed in the sun. Beyond them lay open fields, corn, pasture, even a small chapel with a cross over the door. At roll call, the prisoners were addressed through the translator. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the officer said. "You will work, eat, and rest. You are not slaves. You are prisoners of war and will be treated with dignity." The women didn't believe it. They'd heard the word dignity before from men who didn't mean it. That evening, they were served soup, bread, and coffee. The silence was heavier than the air. A few refused to eat, thinking it poison. Others took a tentative sip, then another, then began to devour everything in front of them. "If this is how they treat enemies," one whispered, "how do they treat their own people?" The question hung there, unanswered. Outside, coyotes howled across the prairie. The women lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of a peaceful land they could not yet trust. The next morning, the rhythm of captivity began. Wake at dawn, line up, eat, work. But nothing about it resembled the brutal labor camps they'd imagined. The barracks were clean, with blankets that smelled faintly of soap. The food came at regular hours. The guards spoke plainly, sometimes even joking. It was as if the war had paused at the fence line. A few days later came the orders. All prisoners will report to the shower house for medical inspection and new uniforms. The announcement spread like cold water. The memories of that first morning of pipes, fear, the hiss of unseen danger returned. When they entered the concrete building, some stopped at the door, refusing to step forward. The sergeant, impatient but not unkind, motioned them in. "Let's go, ladies. It's just water and soap." Inside, the translator noticed the panic building again. He turned to the sergeant. "Sir, they're afraid. They think it's gas." The sergeant blinked. "Gas? Jesus Christ, it's a shower." The pipes creaked, and the first streams burst out. Several women screamed. One collapsed. Others clung to each other, waiting for death. Then Meyer, the translator, stepped forward. Without hesitation, he walked under one of the showerheads, fully clothed, letting the water soak through his uniform. "See?" he said in German, raising his voice. "It's only water! You're safe!" The women stared, frozen. Slowly, one by one, they reached out. Fingers brushed the falling water. Laughter broke through tears. The panic melted into trembling relief. Later that night, Anna, one of the women who had screamed the loudest, wrote in her journal, "When the water came, I cried not because it was cold, but because it was only water, and I realized then that everything they told us about American cruelty was a lie." From that day, the shower room became something sacred. The women would later say that it was there beneath dripping pipes and the scent of soap that they were reborn. The guards didn't understand the significance. They only noticed that afterward the women seemed lighter. They spoke more, Some even smiled. The next week, a group of them were sent to a nearby ranch to help with fence repairs and feeding cattle. The women had expected chains. Instead, they rode in an open truck under a blue sky so wide it seemed to swallow the world. The ranch looked like something from a storybook: rolling hills, horses grazing, the wind rippling through the grass. A handful of cowboys stood waiting, hats tilted back, curious about their unlikely visitors. "You all ever seen a horse before?" One drawled through the translator. The women hesitated, unsure if it was mockery. Then one replied, "Only from far away." The cowboy grinned. "Well, let's fix that." Within minutes, the women were standing beside horses, tentative hands brushing glossy coats. The smell of hay and sweat and sun filled the air. One woman, Elise, flinched when the horse snorted. "She'll bite me," she said. The cowboy chuckled. "Not, unless you give her a reason." He guided her hand to the reins, his voice soft. "Easy now. She can smell fear." When the horse nuzzled her palm, Elise laughed a quiet, astonished laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That day changed everything. When the truck carried them back to camp, the women were silent again, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was something close to wonder. "They let us ride horses," Lise whispered. "They trust us. And we didn't try to escape," Anna murmured. That night, the barracks glowed with a new kind of peace. The women no longer whispered about death. They whispered about horses, about cowboys, about the strange kindness of their captors. The fences were still there, but in their minds, something had already begun to open. The rhythm of camp life became steady, almost domestic. Wake, roll call, breakfast eggs, bread, coffee, work, supper, rest. The women were paid a few cents an hour in camp script, worthless outside, but enough to buy small luxuries: candy, cigarettes, even Coca-Cola. The first time they saw the bottles, they stared like children. Lise bought one, turning it in her hands as if it were a relic. She took a sip and gasped at the fizz. Later she wrote, "It tasted like something forbidden, not because it was American, but because it was happiness." The guards noticed the change. They began to speak with the prisoners more freely, sometimes sharing a cigarette or playing music near the fence at night. The women hummed along, soft German tunes blending with American swing. It wasn't friendship, not quite, but it was something human, fragile, and real. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. The Texas sun burned hotter with every passing afternoon, turning the fences into glowing wires of light and heat. The women grew used to the hum of cicadas, the distant rumble of freight trains, and the slow rhythm of American work. In time, they stopped counting the days since their capture and began measuring them by smaller things, by the way the wind smelled before rain, or by how many buttons they had sewn for the guards' uniforms. Each woman found her own way of surviving. Some worked in the camp's kitchen, peeling potatoes until their hands were raw but warm from the steam. Others tended the gardens, planting rows of beans and corn that would feed not soldiers, but the very people they once called enemies. A few learned to mend engines, their hands black with grease. Elise, who had once trained as a typist in Frankfurt, became the unofficial chronicler of their days. She kept a small notebook hidden under her pillow, filled with quiet observations, a guard whistling a swing tune, a sunrise that painted the world in gold, a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. "Captivity," she wrote, "is not the absence of freedom. It is the slow rediscovery of what it means to be human." In the evenings, the camp would glow with lamplight, and voices would drift through the open windows. The women sang, softly at first, then louder old folk songs their mothers had taught them. Sometimes the guards listened in silence. Sometimes one would play along on a harmonica. For a few minutes, the war outside the fences ceased to exist. Then came the news that no one expected. One sweltering afternoon, as the women worked sorting mail and laundry, the camp commander called them to assembly. He was a tall, sunburned man with the air of someone who'd seen too much war and was tired of it. The translator stood beside him, his clipboard shaking slightly in his hands. "The war in Europe is over," he announced. The words seemed to hang in the air, unreal. Some of the women gasped. Others simply stood there, as if waiting for someone to explain what that truly meant. "Germany has surrendered," the officer continued. "Adolf Hitler is dead." There was no cheer, no relief, only a stunned, aching silence. One woman fainted. Another fell to her knees, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. A few simply stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. Anna turned to Elise and said quietly, "Then everything we believed in was for nothing." Elise didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, the barracks were filled with whispers, fragments of disbelief, fragments of grief. Some wept for lost families, others for the shattered illusion of their nation's invincibility. The walls, which had once seemed like cages, now felt like the only solid thing left in their world. The guards treated them with unexpected gentleness in the days that followed. They knew the prisoners had lost not just a war, but their sense of identity. When one of the women collapsed during roll call, the medic knelt beside her, offering water and a cigarette. Maya, the translator, moved quietly among them, translating letters from home. "Your mother is alive," he told one woman. "Your brother's been captured," he told another. His German had grown fluent, tinged with sympathy he didn't know he could feel. In the weeks after the surrender, the camp began to change. Work continued, but the tension had drained from the air. The guards laughed more freely. The prisoners moved with less caution. The fear that had once ruled every gesture began to fade. One afternoon, as the women returned from the fields, they found the gates open wider than usual. No guards shouted. No one hurried them. The meaning was unmistakable. They were no longer prisoners, only guests waiting to go home. But where was home now? For most, the thought of returning to Germany filled them with dread. Their cities lay in ruins, their families scattered or dead. And there was the shame not just of defeat, but of the terrible truth beginning to emerge about what their homeland had done. Rumours reached them in whispers. Photographs passed between guards and translators' camps, skeletons, mountains of shoes and ash. Some of the women refused to believe it. Others looked at the images in silence, their faces breaking apart as the last pieces of their world crumbled. Anna was one of the first to speak the unthinkable aloud. "If this is true," she said, holding the photograph of Buchenwald in trembling hands, "then we were never the victims." No one answered her. The silence said enough. That night, the women gathered outside, sitting in the dirt under a wide Texas sky filled with stars. The air was cool, the kind that carried a faint scent of grass and dust. Elise spoke quietly. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" Lise shook her head. "I think forgiveness is not ours to ask for, only understanding." The translator, who had been nearby, pretended not to hear. But the next day, he brought them paper and pencils. "Write," he said, "for yourselves, for what you've seen." And they did. Letters, confessions, fragments of memory. Some wrote about their families, others about the first shower, the first act of kindness, the first time they realized that mercy was not weakness. One woman, who had been silent for months, wrote only one line. "I was taught to hate, but the ones I was told to hate taught me how to live." By autumn, the process of repatriation began. The women packed what little they owned, a bar of soap, a worn blanket, a few letters from American guards. The trains would take them to ports in the east, then across the Atlantic to a homeland they no longer recognized. On the morning of their departure, the camp gathered quietly. The guards lined up along the fence, caps in hand. No orders, no speeches, just the soft murmur of farewells. Anna stepped forward first. She looked at Maya, the translator, who had become a quiet friend through the long months. "Will we see you again?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "In another life, maybe." She nodded, eyes shining. If you ever come to Germany, find us. You'll see what kindness you planted." As the women boarded the trucks, the camp fell silent except for the hum of engines and the sound of boots on gravel. When the gates closed behind them, it wasn't with the clatter of chains, but with the soft click of finality. The convoy rumbled away across the prairie, raising a cloud of dust that shimmered gold in the morning light. The women looked back through the slats of the truck at the fences, the barracks, the chapel cross in the distance, and felt something they hadn't expected. Not relief, not joy, a kind of longing. For in that place of captivity, they had rediscovered their own humanity. Months later, in a ruined German town where the streets were lined with rubble, Anna opened a small parcel that had arrived from overseas. Inside was a photograph of the camp at sunset, the fences glowing orange, and a short note in English. To those who learned that freedom is not just the absence of chains. From Texas, with respect. She pressed the photo to her chest and whispered, "It was never just water, it was life." Years turned to decades. The world moved on. The camp fell silent, reclaimed by grass and time. But the stories of those women of their terror, their awakening, their transformation lived on in letters, in journals, in the children they raised to believe that mercy was stronger than hatred. Elise's diary, found years later in a Berlin attic, ended with these words: "We came here as prisoners, but it was in captivity that we became free. I once thought kindness was weakness. Now I know it is the only strength that endures. If someday a soldier stands before another enemy and remembers that water can cleanse more than the body, then all of this will not have been in vain." And somewhere in Texas, when the wind moves through the mesquite trees, the old pipes of the shower house still creak faintly in the sun, a whisper of the moment when fear dissolved and humanity began again.